Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Qrow's Corner, a special episode because today we're doing a quick review of the entire Volume 4 of RWBY, and as always, there will be spoilers. Now that Volume 4 is complete, the million-dollar question remains. How did it fare? Already and throughout the season, there were wild opinions on both sides of this argument, and I won't delegitimize any opinion, but I definitely have my own take on this volume. But in order to make an objective, complete opinion, I've watched the whole volume in one sitting. As a quick recap, Volume 4 picked up where we knew it would. Team RWBY is scattered. Following the fall of Beacon, the members of RWBY have all gone their separate ways. RWBY has joined up with the remaining members of Juniper to make her way to Haven. Yang is struggling with the loss of her arm at her home in Patch with her father Tai Yang. Weiss has been brought back to Atlas to her father Jacques, and Blake has set out on her own back to her home in Menagerie. Now, with the exception of Blake, we knew all of this at the end of Volume 3. We knew that's where everybody was going to be at the beginning of Volume 4. The main story of this volume is each individual's recovery following the fall of Beacon. They each have their own personal struggles that they must overcome. But as this volume unfolds, we finally get a central focus on Lai Ren, one of the more underdeveloped characters on the show. We learn his and Nora's backstory and bring them face to face with the Grimm that killed his parents. At the end of the volume, Team Ranger makes it to Mistral, and all the other members of RWBY are headed in the same direction to reunite the team in the next volume, hopefully. If it doesn't seem like there was a lot going on this volume, there was, but the plot itself was just thin. There was still a lot of information, a lot of things happened, but the plot was not very forward. And I'll get to why that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like I said though, there are a lot of opinions about this volume, but I want to first talk about the opening song, Let's Just Live. Volume 3 ended on a huge downer with the death of Pyrrha. It was shocking and it was tragic. And at the end of Volume 3, we knew, or at least we should have understood, that the tone was going to shift. The first two volumes were incredibly fun and innocent, but in a way they were also very naive. There's a larger plot going on in the story, and it wasn't until the end of Volume 3 did we start to see it unfold. The title song hits home this idea with a few choice lyrics. It used to feel like a fairy tale, now it seems we were just pretending. Then it turns out our life was far less like a bedtime story than a tragedy with no big reveal of the hero's glory. And it seems we weren't prepared for a game that wasn't fair. What this song tells me is that Volume 4 is the real story of RWBY unfolding. I love the first volumes, don't get me wrong, but they were not the big picture. By the end of Volume 2, it seemed we would have this great story of heroic teams that could do wonderful and incredible things, and they would just go out and save the city. That kind of was the impression we got at the end of Volume 2. And while that will still be true that these teams will do amazing things, it cannot and should not be that simple. We were duped just like the characters were, and Volume 3 was the price. It was the turn. Volume 4 showed both the viewers and the characters that this is going to be more than an episodic hero hunter story. It's going to be a story about the characters, even if it only focuses on one or two in depth at a given time. The song says, "Inside we're torn apart, but time will mend our hearts." Have patience, fans, because this is part of the story. This is part of their development. And Rooster Teeth likes to connect seasons and volumes of their shows. They aren't necessarily standalone. Think of Volume 4 like the middle part of a trilogy like The Two Towers or The Empire Strikes Back. It's a bridge story, but it also tears our heroes apart for their own individual journeys. Now, I know that point in particular is one of the bigger fandom gripes with the show, but I vehemently disagree that that's a problem with this volume. From the start, RWBY has been a mysterious show with a lot of references and allusions we had no idea what to make of at the time. They weren't ready to lay it all out for us from the get-go. It was going to be a slow burn. But with that comes ideas and theories, etc., a lot of our imagination filling in the blanks. Volume 4 did more than any of the previous volumes to start to fill in those blanks. Some of our theories were vindicated, others were not, but the important thing is that we are starting to get the larger world-building direction of the show. Now think about it. In all of the first three volumes, all we ever saw, with the exception of the very end of Volume 3, was the Kingdom of Vale. Here, we saw Salem's Realm, wherever that is. We saw Menagerie, Anima, Mistral, some of Atlas. We even saw World of Remnant episodes giving us a look at each of the kingdoms and even the history of the Great War. Even more important is we get some much needed mythology that is clearing up the picture of the larger structure of this story. We now know why Salem is so hell-bent on destroying the academies to get the 4 relics left behind by the gods. And we also know why Ozpin keeps so many things close to the chest about the academies and his own past. People might roll their eyes when it comes to exposition and world building, but I think it is absolutely critical. A show like RWBY cannot afford to go down the path of a show like Lost, though the two brothers myth is eerily similar to the plot of Lost. Likewise, the show cannot just be about making fighting look cool. It's a component, sure, and I want it to stay there, but it cannot be the sole focus of the show. The show needs a dynamic storyline with engaging characters and answers as they are appropriate. If it's going to survive, it needs to be more than just a fighting show. Now, the characters are big, but before I talk about the characters, let me just mention the new animation. Rooster Teeth switched from Poser to Autodesk Maya for performance, for usability purposes, so they could definitely scope out this a lot better than they could previously. But it also gave us a much deeper aesthetic than we had previously. Now, that isn't to say it's seamless, but it's certainly much improved over the first 3 volumes. And I hope they will continue to build on character designs and adding to the world of Remnant as they get more and more comfortable using Autodesk Maya. Alright, let's talk about the characters, because this volume is much more about characters than anything else. Now, while the focus was on moving our characters forward, there wasn't a lot of development. There was backstory and confirmation for characters like Weiss and Qrow, but the only characters who really saw much of a shift in their characters were Ren and Blake. Now, my hopes going into Volume 4 were probably too ambitious for the 3-hour time limit that they had, because I really wanted them to go deeper into Yang's PTSD, as well as Weiss's training. However, one of my biggest criticisms through Volume 3 was how little we knew about one of these central characters on the show, one of the big 8 on the show, Ren. And I'm a little disappointed in how they revealed the monster. It does feel like a manufactured buildup, but I am not disappointed in his backstory at all, or the revelation of his semblance finally. And him and Nora really coming together was the emotional icing on the cake. We also saw a number of new characters, many of whom were introduced with really no further action. Characters like Dr. Watts, Hazel, Ilya, the Albane brothers, they all just showed up really once and then they were done. But obviously we will see them again. But we now know a bit more about Oscar and Jacques and Tyrion, and it's also really cool that we got to meet Blake's parents. I do love Blake's parents. And learn a little bit more about Tai Yang. He's not a new character, but we didn't really get a lot of him just at the very end of Volume 3. And then there were other characters who are still very mysterious, like Salem and Raven, but again, with patient buildup, we will learn more piece by piece as it's appropriate to the story. Obviously, though, it was lacking in a few areas. Like, do I wish there was more development of characters like Ruby and Jean? Of course. But this is only 1 volume. We still have a lot of RWBY to unfurl. So now the answer to the big question. What is my overall take on RWBY Volume 4? I thoroughly enjoyed the season as a whole because I appreciate the creators giving us a broader understanding of the world. It is a fantastical place, and I want to learn everything I can about it. Everything we got in this volume was just a piece of the larger puzzle. It's what they've been building since the beginning, it's what they've been alluding to since the beginning, and now they're actually starting to put those into the actual visual story. There were a few things that I was disappointed in, like the buildup of the Nuclevi, the lack of focus on certain characters, and a rushed penultimate episode. Like I said, my expectations for what I wanted were a lot loftier than what could possibly be crammed into one 3-hour volume. And I also understand why they are limited on time, which is a common gripe that I'm going to completely disregard. But the plot contrivances were minor annoyances in the long run. They weren't something that ruined the experience for me. Now, one of the advantages of watching it in one sitting is certain things did flow better, like Blake's backstory. Or it showed that Yang's story really wasn't as short as I felt it was initially. It's still short, but it's not weak. I did think that Yang had the weakest development in the volume prior to watching it all in one sitting, but when you do that, it does actually feel a little bit more substantial. The only part I really didn't like, though, was when Qrow shows up to stop Tyrion from striking RWBY, and then the very next shot is Oscar reading a book. That is a really iffy transition when you just watch it straight. But overall, I thought it did flow very well, even if it was rushed at times. But, as we should all know by now, pacing is hardly a new problem when we're talking about RWBY. I believe this volume was necessary in order to ground our characters a bit more, as well as build this world. Fighting Beowulfs and Borbatusks is not the same as fighting something like that Nuclevi or a master fighter like Tyrion. The teams are not matched for that level of combat, especially somebody like Tyrion. And likewise, characters like Yang and Blake and Weiss have been holding themselves back, and now they're starting to spread their wings a bit, or they're starting to see their flaws that they can improve upon to become better huntresses. But as the lyrics in the song say, time will mend their hearts, and this volume is that time for mending. After volume 3, they needed it. They needed a volume to kind of redirect their focus and find themselves again, which is precisely what this volume did. And while you could say not a lot happened, I do believe we got a lot of information and a lot of story that moving forward is going to become critical to that development. I don't want naivete, and I don't want ignoring what happened at the end of Volume 3. I'm glad that they didn't. I'm glad they addressed it, and now they're moving the story forward from that point. RWBY is not an innocent show anymore. It is going to be more mature, and the story is going to become a lot more about these characters, their struggles, and their developments. And I am very optimistic about Volume 5 and what it will bring to the world of RWBY. So that's my quick review of RWBY Volume 4 in a nutshell. Let me know your thoughts on RWBY Volume 4, what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it. If there's any theories or questions you have, just anything that you think about after watching this volume of RWBY. And I will post some theory videos in the coming months, including a theory about Jean that I've heard that I'm really starting to like, and maybe some reactions to chibi episodes, just because those are silly and fun. And that does it for this episode of Qrow's Corner. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Nice work. Good job. If you like what you saw, you can just go ahead and click that subscribe button for all videos past and future. You can also head over to my website and see all the other stuff that I do, including the books I've written. So go ahead, click stuff.